typically where human behavior goes awry, right? Is they're doing the best they can in a world and an environment where people are really burnt out, not taking care of themselves. And then we're also not providing clarity. And so on top of it all, it's literally just humans doing the best they can. It's just not enough, but we're also not investing in it. So it's this like toilet bowl swirl of like, we can't get out of it. We have to invest. And when I mean invest, we mean to create the space for the alignment to happen. It's not going to happen as a night job.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. Jaime, thanks again so much for joining us on the show. When I reached out to you to be on RevOps Champions, I mentioned the fact that our RevOps framework has 4 pillars, and they are in this order: people, process, data, and then technology or systems or tech systems. But those are the 4. And it's a little bit weird because when a company approaches us or is referred to us to help them with whatever issues or challenges they have, they very much, because again, we're all trying to simplify as leaders, they have to put us in a box, and the box they typically put us in is the technology box, and which is fair, because ultimately the result of what it is that we're going to be doing for them, whether it's for the first 3 to 6 months project or the ongoing work, is to make sure that their technology systems are working and doing for the business what they needed to do. However, what we've experienced over especially the last 5 years of doing CRM implementations, in bigger organizations where they're completely cross-functional in nature, where it's everything from the sales leader, the CMO, the CFO, the CEO, everybody's involved because technology has become so cross-functional. We've realized a few things. One of them is that for us and for our clients to be successful, the people component is almost, it has to be a given. And it's one that we have very little control over. And of course, we do what we can as far as the training and the adoption of the systems. We do a lot of consulting on the process piece, making sure that they have and are tracking the correct data, etc. Because without that, we cannot do a proper customized implementation of the CRM for their business. So that's kind of the background. But then the thesis of the show is, why do some companies or businesses scale better than others? Anyway, but coming back to the people component, I know, and so some of the language that you use is around, organizational health, which ultimately comes down to, leadership and culture, I believe. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you, because you I believe have this people first, perspective, which is why you do what you do. But I'd love to hear your perspective on, in addition to the people first, which I think is a given in this conversation, mm-hmm. is what else in your experience, do you think allows some companies to grow and scale better than others?
Yeah, well, there's so many things, but the people, it all kind of comes down to leadership, and at the roots is what we find, because we have a similar issue to you guys, is everyone comes to us for strategy. And that's where we started saying, you're going to get strategy, but you're also, FYI, going to get some leadership activation, which is a different term. I think that's something for us to talk about, is not leadership development. That's important too. But how do leaders activate the tools and the skills we're building, that like we're helping them build, and use them for good to drive change, whether it's for a tech partner like you, right? It's for a strategy, because the strategy is typically not the issue. Sometimes we haven't thought big enough. We are seeing that right now in our strategic agility. We don't have the resilience. But what we see is it's the leadership gap of being able to actually drive the conversations, create the communication and transparency to get human energy to flow in a different direction.
Yeah, it's interesting because, last week we had a really good conversation. And Ryan Tansom, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And he also sort of narrowed it down to two things, which is ultimately, leadership, and then, some sort of operational alignment, and what is the connective tissue between those two things. Our jobs and our clients are far more successful when there's good leadership, but we're obviously far more impactful and have more to do with the sort of operational alignment piece, which is it's not a coincidence that it's connecting the four things that I mentioned earlier. Is like, so what are the processes that the business uses, so that the people in the business use to do their work, whether they're in marketing, in sales, in customer service, or anywhere else, and are there clear handoffs in the processes?
It's clarity. That's typically where human behavior goes awry, right? Is they're doing the best they can in a world and an environment where people are really burnt out, not taking care of themselves. And then we're also not providing clarity. And so on top of it all, it's literally just humans doing the best they can. It's just not enough, but we're also not investing in it. So it's this like toilet bowl swirl of like we can't get out of it, but we don't know. And I'm guessing what Ryan is saying too is we have to invest. And when I mean invest, we mean need to create the space for the alignment to happen. It's not going to happen as a night job or in little 30-minute chunks or in a conversation we're going to have in the hallway. You have to carve out the space and the time to do this kind of work. And that's what we're seeing more and more is the request for a facilitator and an advisor to help guide those conversations and ask different questions to get teams aligned on things they already thought they were aligned on to provide that clarity. So there is a lot of that misalignment happening right now, not because people are trying to be misaligned, but we're not creating the space for it.
It's interesting because a lot of, we didn't when we set out to do this podcast, we didn't plan on well, we didn't know what was going to happen, first of all, which is part of why it's so great to do these, because we're all learning along the way. But you talked about clarity, which of course ultimately is around communication, is such a integral and critical part of a successful business. And if you think about it, how can you have alignment, or more specifically operational alignment or good leadership, without good communication? I'd love to sort of dig in a little more with you. So you were saying that ultimately when you get called in, when your team gets called in to work with a company, it's really about strategy. Can you tell us more about exactly what it is that companies are looking for when it comes to strategy?
Yeah. So what we're seeing, and we've seen this over the past few years, is this kind of shift from we've started to get good at the operational aspects, right? There's still gaps and there's still, areas where, but that's why they're coming to you, because they've gotten to a level of maturity that they can see a whole different level, right, of operational efficiencies and maturity there. Where we come in is they've been running on maybe a system that helps them, right? There's a million of them out there, scaling up EOS, all of those kind of operational frameworks. Where we get called is they've got that foundation laid, and they're kind of like, okay, now what? How do we need to think differently to manage through this business climate we're all in, which is wrought with chaos and crisis and changing and unknowns, and right? I mean, we're all running businesses through this. And so where they're calling us is we're more of the outside in perspective than the inside out. We do the inside out stuff, and we would probably tell them to start there, but we're helping say what's happening outside our walls. Are we strategically looking at the market and our industry and what competitors are doing and what they're not doing, and what in the chaos, what opportunities are getting created? Most companies are not doing that. Even the big ones, I'll tell you, we have some pretty large multi-billion-dollar clients that I'm shocked aren't doing that kind of work. And because we've been in a cycle of, first off, the last 4 years have just been crisis and what's right in front of us, and just execute through this quarter, right? To just make it through and figure out the next quarter, which is what everybody needed to do. But we've had this like atrophy of our strategic thinking muscle in our brain. And so we're just paying attention to what's right in front of us instead of really thinking about what's around the next corner and how do we start to plan for that risk because it's going to happen regardless. And so we're doing more of that outside in thinking. So coming in and just really challenging their thinking, challenging a lot of beliefs and some trauma, I think that's been created over the last 4 years for sure. And giving them a different view, which is very energizing for companies right now because there's only so long you can stay in crisis mode, in survival mode. And I think people are yearning for like that we want the light at the end of the tunnel on again. And I kind of feel like we're the light at the end of the tunnel. Like let's help you turn that on again because there's a lot of opportunity in this climate right now. It's just the ones who see it are the ones who are going to be able to come out of it stronger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really I like the way you talked about the the outside in versus the inside out piece, because it's definitely something that we see a lot of, where a lot of organizations that we're working with are looking internally for answers, even though ironically one of the biggest challenges that we've seen in the last 4 years, since 2020, has been around this disconnection with customers, right? And of course, it's happening internally with teams too.
And even who is our customer? So we just had this conversation yesterday, with a Fortune 1000 executive team of they're like, we've totally gotten wrong on who our actual customer is because the channels they sell through. And it was this realization in the room. I didn't have the answer. I just asked a different question that stirred them to go, you guys, we are literally focusing on the wrong customer. And so it's examples like that where it's not because they're not doing hard work and they're not creating the space for these different types of conversations. We're just surviving and getting through all of our meetings day in and day out and expecting that to drive some kind of strategic thinking in the organization. And it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, so it's I guess it's not surprising that whether you're starting from the outside in or the inside out, at some point you got to sort of meet in the middle. And the things that so for example, one of the benefits that we've seen of the work that we do around operational efficiency and operational alignment, and essentially creating systems for marketing, sales, and customer service teams so that they're completely aligned, looking through everything through one single pane of glass, is in fact that all the businesses that we've done this for, their NPS scores, which is of course how they measure their their customer happiness and their customer experience ultimately, which seems to be a really, really high priority right now. That of course has increased dramatically as well, which has just been a real benefit of the work that we've done. By having an aligned internal team, you're suddenly facilitating them to be able to provide a much better customer experience. But this concept that you just introduced around, what if we're not actually targeting or working with the right customers because the customers have evolved, or our ICP has evolved.
And it's a competitive thing. Companies have to evolve. And I think there's also a tendency, and we're seeing this both on as we look at leaders and who should be in the future versus right who got us to this point, and in our thinking is this idea of growth mindset that we're never done. We haven't succeeded in business. It's an infinite game. And so yes, we need to cross a finish line for this year that we have goals around, but beyond that we've got to think in a growth mindset. And there's a lot of organizations that don't realize they're stuck in fixed mindset, that they're only capable of something, or right, we could only ever do that, or we can never have that be our customer, or right, it's all of that thinking that when we come in we challenge it because it still might be true, but let's challenge the thinking to make sure it stands up, right, and not just something we believed when we were half the size we are now.
Yeah, it's really interesting because one of the things we talk about at least every week is one of the most dangerous sayings in business is, this is how we've always done it, right? But when you think about it, there are still so many businesses that, because change is hard, and again, change management is a big part of what we do, otherwise we wouldn't be successful. But again, there's there's a lot of resistance unless you create that clarity and communication ahead of time, in like what's in it for everybody. Why should we go through this change, which is going to make life a little bit harder for a few months? Well, the way you do that, of course, is by letting them know that once we've gone through that change, life's going to be a lot better on the other side.
Right. I call it the lateral shuffle, right? Where you're moving, but you're kind of just moving side to side. You're not making big changes. It might feel like changes because I took a step to the right or a step to the left, but that's not going to transform a business. Eventually, your competition is going to catch you and surpass you. And so I think there's a lot of businesses that only need to know how, they only know how to do that shuffle. They don't know how to really challenge, like, what could we be? How could it look different? And we talk a lot about where do we want to play? And then within that, how do we win? Not just how do we compete? Because don't go into a new market, don't even take on a new segment of a market unless you really believe and you can see a path to winning in that area, not just we'll go and price it close to the competition and see if we can get some revenue. I don't think that is, in this kind of a business climate, a good approach or strategy. So it takes some deeper thinking.
Hmm. And can you talk more about, like, do you have like a framework or examples of, common examples of what winning looks like for some people, or does it really depend on each business?
It really depends on each business and what they want, right? And what the market is actually showing them and what they're capable of. So we have our strategic growth framework that's loosely based on the playing to win model. It's a book that's been out, Procter and Gamble. It's been out since the 80s. But we've modified it because it's a little aggressive and a little more cumbersome than most companies want to kind of deal with. But what we really look at is there's three factors, primary factors to the outside in strategy is what's the external landscape telling us, right? That's from our company, from our customer, from our competition, from our channels, right? Are there distribution channels that are changing that we haven't even paid attention to that we might need to consider, even though we never would have considered them years past? So we're helping them understand that external landscape first, because until we understand that, there's not a lot that we can do to change inside. Then once we have that, we're really pushing on their vision, mission, values, which is very strange for companies because, again, what got you here may or may not be what gets you there. And it doesn't mean we totally change the company and we're going to rewrite your vision and mission statement, but it is a gut check to say, do we need to be a different company 3 to 5 years from now instead of the same company, and just drag that forward, which is a much harder growth, approach. So it's looking at it and saying, and when you do that, you look at people differently to say the people that got us here might not even be the right people. They might be smart in what they did to get us to here, but they're not in the right seats on the bus, and they might not even be on our bus to go to the next level. That's where rubber hits the road, where people start to go, oh, well, maybe we don't want that strategy anymore because it's the hard stuff. It's the people side. And then the third piece is the capabilities, which is exactly what you guys are experiencing, right? What capabilities do we need that we don't even have today, but to get to that next level or to kind of achieve that strategy? Or what capabilities just aren't as strong as they need to be for us to be able to scale into that next level? And so those are kind of the three things we're helping them understand before we even create a strategy. Because if they don't understand that and they can't be honest with themselves, we're going to create a really beautiful strategy and strategic pillars and initiatives year by year that just looks really great on paper, right? But they're not going to be able to execute it. And then what we're going to do then, if we can't execute, is we'll blame the market and the economy we'll blame all sorts of things. And there might be some blame there, but when we look at it is we just didn't prepare what we needed to prepare on our side to be able to achieve it.
Yeah, that's really interesting how it's almost like we're on opposite sides of the same solution, where you're starting, and again, obviously we have to dig into, what are the strategic goals of the business so that we can make sure that we are aligning the systems to solve for that. But ultimately what we're building is really the system that'll make that possible, and then optimize it along the way so that they, as they keep adapting and evolving, the systems keep up with their strategy and their growth goals.
And I look at what you guys do is you're freeing them up mentally, right? And with time to do the big work. that typically would get bogged down in the things that you guys are automating and you guys are building out, right? So as we grow, we have to figure out those things that are kind of pulling us back to where we were before. And that's why tech is such an important thing. But at the same time, we can build the tech, and you guys see this, and not maximize its return as
Right.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's, from a tech implementation and continuing sort of optimization perspective, it comes down to one thing, and that's adoption. If the people who are meant to be using these systems and technologies to make their lives and the business that they're in better, if they're not adopting and using the technology, then it's actually first of all, it's a waste of time and of course a lot of money, but as they actually haven't achieved what they set out to do, which is why we have to be, very rigorous in making sure that we put, to put things in the right order, which is, process, data, and then we'll dig into how to build the technology.
Right, because the tech isn't the success factor. The tech is awesome, but it's not what's going to make it successful. And I mean, I spent 13 years at Cargill in tech, right? I globally deployed systems, and that's where I first started to realize it had nothing to do with the tech. It had everything to do with the human energy moving in a different direction than it moved yesterday. And we have not prepared leaders, and that's hard. That's change and communication skills that you have to invest time to learn. And most companies are not investing at that level.
I mean, tech, every year tech seems to be, and people get tired of it really quickly, that the impact and influence of tech, seems to be getting, more and more invasive. We prefer to use the word powerful. Every year it really comes back. It's down to the leadership of each business to decide, are they going to, invest in seeing what tech can do to make their business better, or not, right?
Right. I mean, tech can either amplify, well, either way, it's going to amplify your strengths or your weaknesses. It's going to
Exactly.
show you. So it's not tech's fault, right?
Yes.
It's showing you literally a reflection of where your capabilities are broken
Yeah.
if tech's not working.
It's funny you should say that. Do you know Dan Sullivan?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Working.
I actually just happened to watch something of his yesterday, where he was being interviewed on a podcast, really about AI and technology and whatever, and he said exactly the same thing, which is, if what you're doing is already good, and you know what you're doing, and you believe in what you're doing, that's going to get better because of AI and technology. Whereas the reverse is also true. If it'll just, you'll just get to the bottom faster if what you're doing is already off track. Or
And that's what, when we went through the pandemic and everybody went home, and right, all of our clients panicked because we don't know how to, our culture is going to suffer because we're all remote. And the first thing we said to them was, if your culture was strong before, it will still be strong. We just have to be intentional in different ways, right, to keep it going. And if your culture had major cracks in its foundation before, they're going to be amplified. You're right. Right. So it's not the remoteness that caused your culture issues. It was that your capabilities and everything you had built weren't the right things to allow your culture to thrive in a remote environment. So much of what we're saying is a mindset shift. And the companies that get it. And they are going to be the ones that eat everybody else's lunch over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's a growth mindset culture that they're building, where we don't know all the answers, right? We're not basing your value here on how smart you are. We need smart people, but we're basing it on how quickly you can fail and learn and be vulnerable, right? And be honest and communicate well, so that we can all keep moving forward. And it's a huge shift in the cultural fabric, I think, of the Western business climate right now, that there's a lot of companies that don't yet see how big of a shift it actually is.
on that note, I mean, in your experience, whether at Cargill or since, in the work that you're doing now, um, do you find, I mean, do you come across situations where, whether it's data or technology, are either you see them as either an asset or a liability for the business that you're working in or with?
I mean, I think it's where the business is at based on whether it's an asset or a liability. I think it's always an asset. I mean, data and knowledge and, having good sources of record for all of this, where it's like in the past it was all over the place, that's power, is what that is. That's power to make decisions that aren't based on gut feeling, that are actually based on what you're seeing in the trends. So I think it's super powerful. Um, but I think most organizations, and this is what you see, think they have data. They just don't have knowledge, right? And they don't have anything to like use it for. So the data is just there, but they're not making decisions based on it. And so I think the risk is I think there's more risk to data just laying around, right? Laying around, because then you've got all sorts of risk on who's accessing it and who, right? And that's what companies focus on, is like controlling who can access the data and protecting it from cyber, all necessary things. But if we have all that risk that's sitting there and yet we're not using it for good and for decisions, then why have it? I mean, that's how I look at it. It's pretty simple and basic, but like use it for something.
So, in the work that you do now through Keystone Group International, does as you're sort of working on strategy with your clients, do you ever get to the metrics side of data? In other words, like what are your success metrics at the highest level? Do you get into that too, or?
We do. Because in order to know how to win, you have to know what metrics prove that you're winning. And it's winning along the way, not winning at the end, right? So we're very focused on that kind of how do we keep that cadence and know we're moving towards that, because it might be we in 3 years we want to have market share 10% more than what we have it now. Great. But between now and 3 years, we have to know how we're winning every week, every month, and every quarter, because otherwise we're not going to stay the course. And I equated the analogy I give to executives is like it's if I say I want to lose 20 pounds, if I only celebrate when I hit 20 pounds, how likely am I going to be to lose 20 pounds? Very unlikely, because my motivation is going to go somewhere else on that day that I just don't feel like it anymore. But if I know I lost a pound this week, I'm going to be like, I can do this. And next week, I can do the same thing. And I feel like metrics and scorecards towards your longer term goals are the exact same thing. We've got to break them down and we've got to be able to report on the activities that are producing the results, which is a lot of what you guys look at, so that we're motivated, like it's working, right? The flywheel's spinning. Let's keep doing it. And if we don't do that, it's super easy next quarter to chase a different shiny object and let the tech just sit there.
It's definitely something that we've also learned the hard way ourselves, but then we see it, of course, with clients as well, where we have to sort of essentially coach them to the point where every person in marketing needs to have a number. Every person in sales, obviously, for the sales folks, it seems a lot clearer that they need a number. But even then, it's still actually that we could have better measurables, weekly measurables for our sales teams than what we currently have. Because ultimately, for any ambitious employee, they also want to know what winning looks like and how to measure it, right?
It's not necessarily, we think of it as it's for us as leaders so that we can run the business well. That is a piece of it, absolutely, because we need those trends. It's actually more for the humans, because as humans, we're wired to achieve, right? So if we aren't creating an environment where each of our people knows how to win day to day, week to week, we're not getting the maximum potential out of them. This is the people component that you talk about, is like we're the average. So there's been studies that have proven the average employee gives us about 40% of what they're capable of. And when I stand and speak in front of groups of hundreds of executives, and I say, I know most of you, when I share that stat, your brain immediately goes to those lazy suckers, right? They're not doing the work. That's not what that stat is saying at all. That stat is saying we aren't showing our people the potential that they don't even realize they have and what they're capable of as leaders. And we're leaving 60% of that results and profit on the table. We're not walking towards it and doing the work. So that's where it all comes back to leadership again, is business results are driven by good leadership, knowing how to get the most out of people and the highest performance.
I know we have a good mutual friend, Gary Braun, and we were actually having that exact conversation yesterday. And it was a good reminder of just, the subtle differences between leading a good successful sales team and not. And it ultimately comes down to, what is that weekly conversation that a sales leader is having with their sales folks on did we achieve our goals for the week, and if not, let's talk about why not and what we can do differently so that we have a better chance of doing it next week.
And you're doing it for them instead of to them. Because as leaders, we feel like, well, we're going to do that to them, and that's a bad conversation. And we're doing it for them because we're helping brainstorm on how we can be more successful next week. So it's such a mindset shift that leaders need to make.
And it's interesting because one of the other things that one of the things that probably led to that conversation with Gary was, Dan Sullivan. Another thing that one of the many amazing things that he says that of course are true is leaders or entrepreneurs don't have unrealistic goals; they just have unrealistic timelines. And if you don't create the timeline for whatever that thing is to achieve, whether it's 25 years or 10 years or a week, you're not creating the necessary context and clarity to use your language of what each person needs to do to be successful. I want to speak more specifically. So that last question was maybe a little open-ended as far as data and technology or metrics. But so on the technology side, with the businesses that you're currently working with, how often does it come up that technology is a potential solution or is causing friction in their businesses?
I think tech's always kind of at the table as part of the conversation. What we see is it's their relationship with tech and maybe good or bad experiences in the past and how they look at how tech can propel them forward. So we have a client that has a really strong tech leader right at the table who has experience in other companies, similar industry, and is really helping them almost futuristic. Like this is where it's going. And then we have clients who don't even have a tech leader at the table. And that makes me sad actually coming from tech because I mean tech is the enabler of everything. Right? No, the smallest things you don't even think about to all of the strategic things that you're going to do because it's how you're going to do it profitably. Right? I think of tech as being a profit lever. And up front, right, the price is that's where people get a little bit, but when you actually do the work and figure out what it's saving you, the return on investment, tech is what's going to allow you to do the other investments, right? If we're doing it right. But I think the integration piece is probably the piece that is where there's the most profit erosion, is not understanding, right? They can buy something from you and something from someone else and something they bought 20 years ago, and they don't have the capability in-house to actually say, how do these all play well together versus compete with each other for our attention and our resources? And
Yeah.
that integration piece is usually the biggest gap.
Yeah, no, that's a big challenge. The common term that we use for that is called tech bloat,
Oh,
where
yeah.
because technology is advancing at a rate that it is, and there's new technology coming out faster than ever. The and especially in organizations where permission to purchase cheaper software is given to different leaders at different levels, you suddenly end up, if they have an IT leader, or if they bring in an IT leader at some point and they start doing an audit of all the software, and what we see happening more and more now is, because this has become such a big challenge, is the CFO is coming to all the functional leaders, the CMO, the VP of sales, the head of customer service, et cetera, and saying, well, guys, you're each using 37 different pieces of software or tools or technology. Can we sit down and figure out, like, what are we using each of these for, and what is it ultimately what are we trying to do with these things, and which ones can we get rid of? And it's pretty scary how quickly you can actually get rid of, 2/3 of all your tools that you're paying a monthly subscription for.
Well, and we look at this as we've had more discussions in the past 6 months around enterprise architecture, which more corporate people would understand, but we're having this with small and mid-market companies to say, you need an enterprise architecture of all of these systems, what their purpose is, what their source of record, right? What data they actually own, meaning that's where you would go as your source of record, and a business owner and a tech owner for all of them. And they just look at you because they've, again, the bloat is just like added on, added on, added on. And eventually we're at a point where we can't add on anymore. And we're not maximizing this one tool, probably could do 3 other things that you bought that other tool before to do. And it's this, you got to go back and clean that up. And most organizations just don't have the capability of enterprise architecture to really think broader and more globally on the tech that they have and say, actually, all the pain is not because of this tech, it's because we have a big hole in the middle of all of our tech that we need these things to talk to each other. Yeah, so I think people are starting to understand. I just don't think in the mid market, there's always the capabilities there um, for somebody inside to help guide that.
No, you're right, but I mean, and the mid market is essentially where we play, right? It's companies between 100 and 1,500 employees, and it's definitely the light bulb is going on for more and more companies in that space. Of course, we obviously would like it to happen faster than what it is,
Right.
but rather late than never, as they say. Yeah, so that's and then I guess the other question that kind of ties some of this together is do any of the companies that you work with use the term RevOps at all?
Mm-hmm. We're hearing it a lot more than we ever
Okay,
did.
okay, and to the point where they have a RevOps team or a RevOps leader.
Leader, they're certain that, yep. Yep, and
Yeah,
that wasn't even something that I even understood, right? I would say 5, 6, 7 years ago, I didn't know what RevOps was. I mean, I could obviously figure it out, but it wasn't something that was ever in the conversation. And in the last week, I've heard it in almost every meeting now. So we're starting to hear it. And I don't know if they're using it right or they really understand what it is, but they're starting to hear the message, right? That they've got to think about it differently than what they thought about it in the past.
yeah. Well, that's really great news. And we're kind of seeing the same thing. And it's interesting. We've had a few clients that we started working with, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months ago, where when they started working with us, they either didn't know what it was or they definitely didn't have anyone with that title. And 3 to 6 months in, they actually appointed someone, director of RevOps or whatever the case may be, because they suddenly started seeing. So all the stuff that we're talking about, they started seeing why it's so critical. Because one of the functions of a RevOps person or a RevOps team is to do a continuous audit of all the tools and technology that is being used in marketing, sales, and customer service, to the point that when it's all cleaned out, or when the CMO or the VP of sales or the head of customer service comes to them and says, we need a new tool and this is what we need it for, they can then take a little bit of time to go back and say, well, are any of the tools that we already have, do they have that functionality, or are they potentially adding that functionality in the next week or month or whatever? Which is crazy how fast that's happening too. And then go back and say, well, how soon do you need this? If you need it like tomorrow or next week, then yes, I've identified 1 or 2 tools that can do the job. One of which we might have, or don't. Or can you wait for a month until our existing software vendor builds that functionality into their product or launches that
Well, I
functionality?
think it's interesting too, because I mean, you and I have both worked in environments where sales and marketing and customer service, it sometimes is just a pissing match, to be honest, and finger pointing, and they never really were collaborative. Very few organizations have they kind of solved that. I think RevOps is the answer to that because there's transparency, there's shared ownership of things. There's clear metrics that are owned metrics between sales and marketing, and it's starting to really identify those roles with more clarity. And so that's why I think companies are stepping towards it, because they're trying to get those teams to work better together.
Because essentially what's how it's evolved for those people listening who aren't familiar with it is, again, in the mid-market space, let's say 500,000 person company, there, many of those have had someone in marketing ops, and they've had someone in sales ops, or they've had someone in service ops, but it was there was still someone in a silo. And of course, what RevOps is doing is making sure that, first of all, we remove as many of the silos as possible, but they essentially become an enablement team that is enabling marketing, enabling sales, and enabling customer service to be the best that they can be at their jobs, and making sure that they're aligned between each other. Which, I mean, if you think about it again, going back to what you were saying earlier about what you and I have seen over our careers, and a lot of most people listening would identify with this too, which is this continuous friction between marketing and sales primarily. Whereas we more and more we're seeing that dissipate, because they now realize that they are actually better together, because we now have ways to align them, whether it's aligning their processes, aligning the metrics or the KPIs that between that their handoffs, and then of course giving them access to tools that are all aligned, and not where they're not stepping over each other.
And seeing those shared goals, right? So in the strategy side, that's where we're starting to see the conversation shift to seeing that shared ownership of some of the, like, we're going to go into a new market, right? Or launch a new product. It's a joint effort. And so it's promising. I mean, I think there's a long ways to go, but it's promising to me to kind of see that collaboration instead of competition.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Jaime, then have you ever been involved in a big technology implementation yourself?
Yeah. So when I was at Cargill, when I ultimately left, I was running the largest SAP implementation, right? So I was I was doing the portfolio management for that. So that was the largest one SAP had ever done at the time.
I'm sure it was smooth sailing the whole way from
Oh,
beginning to end,
yeah.
right? Yeah,
It's super clear. And so I think it's still going on in some pockets. And I've been gone for 12, 13 years.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Because one of the questions we like to ask is, because there's very, I mean, we hope that we're part of the solution improving this, but the reality is an technology implementation for, especially across marketing, sales, and customer service for any company, it is a complex thing, but it's becoming simpler and simpler because of the models and frameworks that we use. But ultimately, what every company that's been through it and got through it, and are now on the other side of it, will tell you that the struggle that they went through was absolutely worth it, because the alternative of not doing it, would essentially have denuded the company's value to an extent, which is on a scale of, I guess you pick the number. But so ultimately, the leaders have to decide at some point, look, we have to, we don't have a choice, we have to do this, and let's just make sure we do it in the best possible way.
Yeah, we're having a lot of conversations about, right, there's hard work, which just means we put in a lot of time and a lot of effort, and then there's uncomfortable work. We can power through hard work. It's the uncomfortable work, which is the change and the doing something different than we did, right? That is where stuff gets hung up. And I think a lot of organizations are realizing they aren't good at doing the uncomfortable work, although they see the case studies, right? And all of that on the other side of, they know they want to be there, but they need the help doing the uncomfortable work to get there. And that is it's an absolute competitive advantage
Yeah,
for companies
yeah,
to think that way.
yeah. Which of course, and you have the probably one of the best analogies, that exists today on how to represent that. Which of course is, you was last year you climbed Kilimanjaro, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, this is why so many companies use that terminology of climbing the mountain or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
because the uncomfortable work is what it takes to really achieve something like exceptional, right?
Right. I have a quote that after I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro that kind of sums up the journey, right? And again, I say climbing mountains is it's we all climb mountains in our personal lives and our business lives, but you don't climb a mountain for the world to see you. You climb a mountain for you to see yourself and the world differently. And it's that perspective shift that leaders and organizations need to do right now to say there is a better way, and we have to be willing to invite partners in to kind of see a different future than we have today. And that's what you guys do. That's what we do, is we're just partners to help you see something different and then help you along the way if that's the direction that you want to go.
Help others be better, which I guess is kind of the ultimate leadership quality, right? Is if you can make those around you look good. That's awesome, Jaime. So first of all, thanks again so much for joining me today on RevOps Champions. The last question I wanted to ask you was essentially what advice would you give to, so if you think about a mid-market business, 100 to 1,500 people right now, what is one piece of advice that you would give them as they strive to continue to scale and grow better than their competition, let's say?
Create the space for different conversations and ask different questions of yourself than you've ever asked. And sometimes they can do that on their own, and sometimes they need partners like us. But like, you have to create the space for these types of conversations. It is not going to happen in your executive team meeting. It's not going to happen on a random Friday. You have to carve the time out. And this is also for those of you running on, operational frameworks like EOS or Scaling Up or Pinnacle. It's also not the work you're going to do in your quarterly sessions. I cannot be clearer on that. Quarterly sessions are for planning, not strategy. Strategy is not a plan, and a plan is not a strategy. And so you have to start separating the two and making sure you're carving out time to do both, because they're both important. They're just very different. And to be competitive and to scale, you have to have a strategy that your plan is anchored to.
That's really good. And of course, well, in that case, I need to ask you another question, because we obviously, we both, well, you probably know a lot more than even I do, people in that space, the EOS, Scaling Up, Pinnacle, you name it. I just met someone recently from Bloom Growth. I didn't realize that they're now doing the same thing. Do you see that more companies that use one of those operating systems are introducing additional days for strategic planning before they go and do their 1 day or 2 day offsites to do the actual operational planning?
The ones who are realizing that those operational frameworks aren't strategy, yes. And we're actually recommending, whether you use us or someone else, do it off cycle. So you should be doing that mid Q2 or mid Q3. So it's not in your normal cycle, because you're in a different mindset when you're in those quarterly planning or annual planning. That's not what strategy is. You have to do it off cycle. You have to do it off site. You got to kind of get out of your environment to be able to do it really well, because it takes different thinking than running the daily business. And so we're pushing clients to go somewhere to do it, right? To really remove themselves even overnight for their kind of day to day is ultimately the best approach.
That's interesting, because one of the things that we've now started doing, and we're kind of using the strategic coach terminology, is we're calling that the sort of the 10x planning, and then our sort of EOS quarterly and annual planning is our 2x planning, but we have to keep them separate, otherwise it just gets
muddled together.
Which is
great.
Also dangerous.
Yep.
Good stuff. Well, Jaime, thanks again so much. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just appreciate you having this conversation. I think it's an important one for leaders to listen into, about how we need to think differently about the future. So appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful that I was able to learn through this 45 minutes together more about what it is that you do, and obviously share that with our audience too, because I'm sure you can bring a lot of value to a lot of the folks listening.
Appreciate that.